First of all, for those of you who have logged in, I want to welcome you to this Societe de Chimie Industrielle webinar on the challenges facing the biotechnology industry. Before I introduce the topic and our speaker today, I just want to remind everyone that Societe de Chimie Industrielle is a 100-year-old organization, nonprofit, that focus on serving the life science and chemical industries. And in fact, through a whole series of luncheon meetings, webinars, we give scholarships to students studying biochemistry and chemistry, etc. And we have mentorship programs for them where we match our members with the students who are getting PhDs or undergraduate degrees. And we also have an award dinner, the International Palladium Medal Award, which is awarded every 2 years to a leader who has contributed to the industries we serve. So I hope those of you who have attended our events and our webinars have enjoyed them, and those that have not, I just encourage you to keep track of the events that we have and to participate either electronically or in person. The last thing I do want to say is that we do have another webinar coming up on an interesting area, which is on September 25th, which is on the evolution of rare earth, which of course has a big impact on many, many industries, life sciences, pharma, electronics, so forth. And we have a wonderful speaker who'll talk about the history of the development of rare earths and where things stand today. So with that, though, I'd like to really, I'm very excited about introducing today's speaker, Lisa Henderson. Lisa is very well known to people who are involved with the biopharma industry, and she is the editor-in-chief and the group content director of 2 publications. So I'm sure, Lisa, you enjoy the 2 salaries that they give you. One is Pharmaceutical Executive, which is the leading publication serving the C-suite for the biopharma industry around the world, but also applied clinical trials, which of course obviously is heavily related to the biopharma side as well. So she enjoys 2 hats. We'll talk a little bit about her background, but we felt this was a very good topic and a timely one because so many things are happening with the biotech industry today that are both good and bad. The last thing is I just want to talk about logistics. All of you are logged in through this video conference system. What we're going to do is we'll spend, after a brief introduction that Lisa will give about herself and her publication, we're going to engage in a kind of a dialogue where we're going to talk through some of the issues, positive and negative. But our hope is to take about 30 minutes to do that, and then really open it up to questions from all of you. Now, there are 2 ways that you can ask questions. If you look on your screen, you'll see that there's a chat function, which is the old-fashioned way, which probably works the best, where you just type in your question, and both Lisa and I will be able to see it. And the other is a Q&A function, which doesn't always seem to work, but it does the same thing, which allows you to ask questions and then it puts them in a queue for us. So I encourage all of you to ask questions after we get through this dialogue portion. So here we go. So maybe, Lisa, before we start into the main topic, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your publication, but also about your background, because you had a long career in journalism and you weren't always involved with the biopharma industry.
I have not been always involved in the biopharma industry, but thank you, Peter, and thank you to the audience for having me here today to talk about my favorite subject, which is biopharma. And as Peter mentioned, so I'm a trained journalist. I have a degree from Temple University in journalism and started out in business-to-business journalism from the start. So that would be all your journals that go to specific industries. So I started with information technology, which was, I think, a great foundation for me. I was there for about 8 years, and then just worked my way up through college recruitment, where we published journals to diverse audience. They were drop shipped to college campuses during the time when engineering and nursing programs were really recruiting minorities to come to their schools. That was also a great time for for them to learn how to get into the colleges and into the companies with those programs. And then I moved into my first foray into healthcare was with a managed care publication. So that really opened my eyes to the healthcare system itself. Then I moved into clinical trials, specifically working in Boston for Center Watch, which was a very solid publication in the investigative site and CRO area, and then on to Applied Clinical Trials in 2007. And then I took on pharmaceutical executive with that, as Peter says, those extra perks, which they're not. No.
Yeah. And those of you who don't either go to the website or subscribe to the publication, you really should.
Yeah, it's
really try to focus on the issues that, whether you're in research or you're on the business side or marketing or the regulatory side, they try to cover the issues that really are very important to do your job.
Correct. So we do cover the horizontal, and it's very, the chain of drug development, and pharmaceutical exec can be found at www.pharmaexec.com. We love the publication, obviously, but it does have a lot of information. So thank you, Peter. And thank you for serving on our editorial advisory board, where we get a lot of our great insights and ideas from our board members. So
yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's been
great.
Well, let's start into this. I think maybe we can start with, this has been both a wonderful time for biotech, in terms of innovation and new technologies and so forth, and new methods for screening, et cetera, but also a challenging time as well. But let's start on the positive side. And, what are the things that in the last, 4 or 5 years you think have been changes that have been very helpful for the biotech industry?
So I think, specifically, there's been organic growth in those physical locations where biotech, has found itself in San Francisco, San Diego, Cambridge, of course, the local and in the outside of the Philadelphia area, and in Philadelphia and North Carolina. There's been a lot of organic growth and economic development for those companies, a lot of support from the regional areas. I think that the positives on the regulatory side, obviously, we've seen this past year the number of compounds that have been approved from companies that have never had an approval before now exceeds those from big pharma, from large pharma. So I think that's over 60%. It might be, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but this is the first year that we're seeing approvals from companies that have never gone through this process before. Huge plus. Regulatory, FDA welcomes biotech to come and speak to them about their science, about their trial designs, about reaching the right patients for, those trials. So those are all major positives I see, Peter.
Yeah, no, it's been very, very noticeable, and of course also it's been positive that the biotech companies have had an easier access to capital the last couple of years than they've gone through some tough years where it's been really tough to raise money both on the private and the public markets, right?
Yeah, that's true, and they do spend a lot of time and resources on their getting their messaging correct now. I feel that they really want to explain their science, to investors, and, to the general public, really, but to investors so that they understand their unique message, because clearly there are so many developments across the board that it is hard sometimes for them to articulate that science and kind of, get noticed in the crowd, I guess is the best way to put that.
Plus, of course, the amazing thing is that the biopharma industry has gone from primarily things that just prolong life, for example, to actual cures for hepatitis C and so forth. It's just amazing, right?
It is.
And so this is a real renaissance in terms of new technologies and methods that that are just amazing. I think one other point too, of course, is the emergence of orphan drugs, right?
Yeah.
But that's a kind of a double-edged sword, right?
So it is. It becomes the orphan drug area is appealing because you can get a fast track or breakthrough designation from a regulatory perspective. But of course, the patient populations are much smaller.
Mm-hmm.
For orphan and rare diseases, it takes a very long time for patients to get diagnosed. So even finding a patient that might be suffering from that rare disease, it's not that they're not looking, they literally don't know yet that they have that disease. So that's challenging. Conducting the trials is challenging because, again, in rare diseases and orphan diseases, the people and the experts are spread globally. You know, it's not where you can just ramp up a clinical trial in one place. You know, so it is challenging.
On the other hand, at least up until now, they've been able to charge a fair amount to help compensate for the small population group. And the other plus that actually people don't focus on is their dependence on big pharma has gone down, because obviously if you're selling an orphan drug, you may only need to get to 5 research centers and where the patients are treated, and suddenly the big pharma sales force becomes less necessary, right?
So that is true, and that gets to your point about the funding. They can fund themselves, but the goal used to be, I want to sell. I just want to sell my company, correct, and just move on to the next thing. But now many of the smaller biotechs, biopharma are on a parallel path where they'll be, maybe I'll sell, but maybe I got to keep myself going through this commercialization period. So to that end, they're having to become well-versed in those issues, when they make it to into phase 3, where there's a likelihood that they're going to be approved. They have to plan for that, and they're not necessarily going to be sold to a big pharma. So they're parallel planning, and yes, there's a lot of data out there, though, Peter, on whether or not you need big pharma.
Right.
And in some cases you do, because they are well versed in market access issues and well versed. They have all the the connections already in place to get the message out once the drug is approved and how they're going to get it to the patients. But to your point, there's different pathways for reaching the smaller patients, smaller populations. Yeah.
So we've been positive for about 12 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can now start talking a little bit about the challenges. I think a logical one, since we were talking about orphan drugs, is the pricing issue, right? Which is a real erosion. I mean, even for orphan drugs, there's pushback on, they may say, well, gee, maybe there's only 1,000 patients, but $300,000 per patient is still a big number. So can you talk a little about the pricing side, what you think the situation is, but also with all these proposals and things that are out there, what do you think is going to happen?
Pricing's all as complicated, is truly complicated. So there are a number of schemes out there. I don't like to call them schemes, that sounds negative, but a number of designs out there for, getting these drugs to the patients. You probably heard of the value-based contracts. So if the drug doesn't work, or we'll take back, you don't have to pay for it. There is, in the case of Luxturna, so with Spark Therapeutics, which is under currently being with Roche, but they're vetting through all the government vehicles to Roche buying Spark. But for their drug for inherited retinal disease, they priced it for $425,000 per eye, but it is a one-time curative therapy. But they're saying, if it doesn't work, well, we'll, fund it back. They don't really, they have such confidence in their products that they are designing these pricings for the patients and the payers.
Yeah. And to be fair, in many cases, if you actually looked at what the alternative cost to society and to the patient be if they didn't
Correct.
have the cure, there's a legitimate argument that in many cases that, say for hepatitis, right? If you don't, then you've got a serious liver problems, or you've got a liver transplant. So the amount of money it might take to take care of that patient may easily equal the amount of the cost of the drug. But on the other hand, for a lot of people, it's hard to get their mind around that.
Right. So just to go back to the Luxturna example, they designed it so that the drug, they took into account how much, to your point, that lifetime of care would be for someone that is losing their sight and going literally to go blind, and how much would that cost, someone if they had lost their sight in a civil action, where it was an accident, how much would they have been awarded in that kind of transaction? It was like over $1 million. So clearly, to take care of their needs over a lifetime. So clearly, the price, which is, it's high sticker shock, like you said, but that price over the length of a lifetime is, it's pretty reasonable.
Yeah. Any comments on this? There are all sorts of proposals that are coming out of the Trump administration.
Yeah, so I hear that there's a lot of backpedaling on the international referencing.
Right.
Yeah, so that's probably a good thing. I don't see where it goes. I mean, there are a lot of data. I was just reading yesterday data around Medicare and Medicaid pricing in Massachusetts, a huge report that came out with the discrepancies between prices that, that state is paying for Medicaid drugs vis-a-vis the pharmacy benefit managers. So that whole area is kind of ripe for inspection, or at least another look at. The rebates are off the table. That ended last month. So I don't know where that leaves a lot of people. I want to go back to
so many of the proposals that have been floated have then been taken down. I mean,
yeah.
For example, this proposal that if drug companies advertise on TV, they have to say, here's what the list price is. Well, that's died. And
Right.
the proposal Trump had about, for those of you who don't know, the concept was Medicare, would not pay any more than what was being the price anywhere in the world.
Right.
So if you have a drug that costs you $100 here in the U.S., but in India it costs $5, then the U.S. government will only pay no more than $5. The problem with that, of course, is it doesn't solve the fundamental problem, which is probably the price in India is too low. And drug companies have no way of trying to price higher, and yet to make the entire amount of money to get a profit on the research. So it doesn't, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, right? But it's being debated, back and forth, right?
There is a lot of policy discussion in this area. Obviously, it's not going to be solved tomorrow. It's just going to continue. And as you said, there have been these initiatives. And then when you do the deeper dive into the actual, how it impacts the rest of the healthcare budget or that kind of thing, it becomes another argument. The pharmaceutical, in the end of the day, it's only 20% of your overall healthcare spend. And I'm not saying it's not insignificant. Obviously, it can, like you say, it's curative in some cases where you would no longer need that rest of the healthcare system, and drugs are necessary, for so many other things. I was speaking to a gentleman 2 days ago for a new antibiotic that is on the market. Nobody's developing new antibiotics, because you can get generics for that, but they've come up with one that might be a little better that's on the market. So, the pricing issue in the overall scheme of healthcare should be addressed. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, if you really look at where the cost escalation is, a lot more of it is in hospital care and so forth.
Yeah,
Very little is being done, and no one is making speeches about we have to rein in the cost of hospital care.
that's true.
And
I agree
unfortunately,
with
what's
you.
happening, you know, that's accentuated that is it's been so crushing for independent doctors to survive because of all the regulations. They're joining hospitals, but then the hospitals are charging far more for exactly the same procedure that you would pay if you went to an independent clinic or independent doctor. So there are lots of problems. It's not to say the drug industry is not guilty of some things, but
Yeah,
they are. I think they are being people are, you know, politicians are focusing too much attention on the drug industry and not enough on the other parts of the healthcare system.
I
Yeah.
agree. I agree.
Now, when you talk about pricing, you can't avoid talking about PBMs, right? And the whole structure of the, at least in the US, how
Yeah.
drugs are priced and distributed. I'll tell you a story. There's a guy who is a very famous guy who is chairman of many different companies, and he was asked whether he wanted to be a candidate to be the chairman of a big pharma company, and his knowledge was not that high. So he, as a favor, he asked me to sit down and tell him how it worked. And after an hour of telling him how the whole pricing worked, he said, "Wow, this is unbelievably difficult."
It is.
But one of the issues now is with the you know, consolidation, vertical consolidation, right, and the acquisition of PBMs by insurance companies. You know, the question is, what's that going to do? Any opinion on that?
Um, okay, so I have a lot of concerns around PBMs, and I'm sure, you know, I just always go back to Kenneth Fraser's. I'm, you know, going to quote that, you know, he knows where he's getting his money, where he spends his money, but he doesn't understand how the PBMs make their money, you
Right.
know, so, and that's paraphrasing very loosely, but it's true. There's a lot of, what do you call it? Non-transparency. There's really needs to be some
It's opaque.
transparency.
Essentially, it's opaque, right?
Right. It is very opaque. And there really needs to be some transparency because, to your point, you know, if you put the price of a drug on an ad, number one, most people don't pay that price. But if one person pays that price because they're under a certain PBM and another pays another price because of their PBM, then what does that do for the pharma company? That doesn't help the patient. That doesn't help the consumer. It just, again, cloudies the water. It makes it opaque. So yeah, there's a lot of problems in the supply chain that, you know, I'm not a fan, but.
Well, and you know, we had a very senior guy, one of the PBMs that,
Yeah.
we have our annual pharmaceutical
Yes.
executive
Yeah.
summit.
Yeah.
And the guy in the Q&A session got hit with a bunch of questions about, okay, how much do you guys make and where's your value add? And it was a struggle for him.
Yeah.
And it's not only just price, they recommend formularies as far as what drugs can even be considered
Right.
by a hospital, whatever. And that has a huge impact as well, because, you can literally, decide, they can literally decide that a certain drug is not even being considered on the list at all.
Right. Yeah. So, and then to get back to the biotech, so Luxturna directly works with the payer. They say, you pay for this, we'll ship it to the physician and they'll take care of it for them. So they, there is kind of an opening guidance, FDA has guidance around the companies meeting or giving payers information about their drugs before they're approved, so kind of the payers can look at what those drugs are. But the PBMs and the formularies, that gets into big pharma's expertise in market access again. So that's where some of the smaller companies could benefit from a partnership with a larger company, because of that, just knowing that landscape. You don't have that knowledge. It's really hard to just jump in and do that without something. So
now I'm going to switch to something which is also a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
You'll take your pharmaceutical executive hat off and put your clinical trial hat on or whatever.
Okay.
That is this, ongoing escalation in the cost of clinical trials. And it's not only the cost, but with so many clinical trials, it's even getting to be a challenge to be able to get patients enrolled, right, for your trials. Can you comment both on the cost, but also some of the challenges that the biotech companies are having in terms of, being able to run their clinical trials and get get patients signed up and so forth?
Yeah, so clinical trials is just a small part of healthcare in and of itself. So it's an amazingly highly regulated area, and it's gone from, as you said, because the number of trials have escalated. So, there's so many drugs in the pipeline and in development at this point. So that's one reason for the cost inflation. But there's also for the you could look at the protocol designs. Maybe they're a little large. Maybe you don't need to collect every single one of those data points. There's a lot of data around the cost of how much you add to your clinical trial that you want to collect, how that impacts the price. So the companies, the sponsors is what we call them on the trial side. The pharmaceutical companies, the pharmaceutical manufacturers are the sponsors on that side. So they really need to look at what they really need, what data they really need to collect for their submission. So it's that's one factor. The other factor is that companies largely do not conduct their own clinical trials anymore. It's outsourced.
Correct. Yeah.
So this outsourced industry has grown since from a small, really a cottage industry of 30 years ago to a very sophisticated enterprise in and of itself. So I think whenever you're looking at a third party, and I'm speaking again to PBMs, and you're automatically looking at increased costs. Now, some people will say that the argument had always been for CROs that because they were so efficient at conducting clinical trials, that the spend would be smaller. Well,
it hasn't really worked out that to be that way, right?
Correct.
So for those of you who don't know, CRO is a clinical research organization, and these are independent third-party firms that do the clinical trials and research and screening of compounds for clients who are either biotech or pharma companies.
Right. So for a long time, it was big pharma, big CRO, and there's about a handful of the very large CROs now. So, but now they've all realized, as I stated earlier in this webcast, that the compounds coming into the pipeline are from smaller biotech, that those drugs are out there. So they've all formed their own special units to deal with this burgeoning population of drugs coming through. The problem for the biotech, again, is they're not educated. Clinical trials is not their forte. They're usually coming from science. They're coming from a science, and they need to know how to, and they want to get it to the patients. They just don't know how. So CROs aren't necessarily taking advantage of the smaller biotech, but what happens is they have their own checklist of, this is how you do a trial, without looking at resources or necessity. So it could be that if they really looked at the trial, they could cut back a little bit. Not everything has to happen the same exact way for every single trial. So biotechs feel a little left out. They feel that the CROs don't really take into account their needs. They feel that they need too much oversight that they don't have because they're smaller entities. They don't have the staff, to oversee a clinical trial. But
so it's kind of it's going to be kind of a struggle as to what's the right decision for a lot of these biotech companies.
Right. And
related to that, separate from being on the board of Societe de Chimie Industrielle and head of programs and running these webinars, I actually run an investment bank, Younger Partners, that focus on life sciences. And one of our senior people was the former deputy commissioner of the FDA and
Hmm.
most recent past one. And he said it's become much more challenging. But the other part is, to the extent that you're trying to introduce your drug, not only in the US, but abroad, now you're having to deal with all myriad of different types of standards in China, in Europe with the EMA and so forth. And they don't all do it the same way. In fact, in China, they keep having to revamp their version of the FDA because they keep running into problems, right?
Right.
So it becomes an even bigger problem if you have aspirations beyond just the US.
It's true. It's very difficult to follow the regulatory requirements globally, so we have one for the US. The EMA is centralized, but you still have all the member states that have their own clinical trial regulations that you have to file regulatory submissions. They're trying for a lot of harmonization, but it's very hard for the smaller companies to keep track of all those requirements and comply. Compliance for smaller companies is tough. It's really tough because they don't have
Plus, as the science has changed, then it really changes how the regulatory folks deal with approvals. And so as we move to, biosimilars and all these other things, then you just can't, you have to change, there's a change in how they're regulated. And that presents a problem, obviously, right? For everyone, right?
So biosimilars is an interesting space right now. We just had movement this past month in some biosimilar approvals launches in the US, which has not happened. The EMA is far ahead of us on biosimilars in those programs, but we're seeing movement here now. So, but yeah, you're right. That everyone is, and to your point with China, they're very, very interested in learning the science and getting companies in, and all of them, the FDA, the EMA, they all have to stay abreast of what's going on with the science, as well as how the data is being collected, which changes as much, the technology programs that are available. So it's to their point, though, I'm telling you, they really are open to learning and changing. Regulatory is not the bottleneck that people think it is. So
now, as we near the end of this 30-minute discussion period, is there anything either on the positive or negative side, additional thought that you'd want to raise before we open it up to Q&A?
I just think that this is I've heard it. I believe it's the golden age of medicine. We are just, if you just look back in the 10 years, I was speaking with a CEO of a biotech a couple months ago, and he remembered going to his first bio, I think in 2001, 2002, and just how much it's grown, but he says the energy in biotech, the people are so exceedingly smart, but also just want to really help patients. They really do. They come from science. They come from research. They really are out there for the good of people, getting these
many of them started out as medical doctors, right?
Correct. Yeah, you're right, Peter. You're right. And and then there's a lot that are in investment now. They science, they see that maybe the lab wasn't my thing, so they go over to the business side, but they can apply that knowledge and really make it work. There's a huge patient-centric movement in biopharma that I think biotechs and smaller biopharma already had, because they're already looking at those smaller patient populations. They already know that the diseases that they're targeting are for smaller, devastating illnesses, so they were already patient-centric. So big pharma can learn a lot from small pharma, and small pharma has a lot of opportunity to build things. When I say things, I mean their programs, their internal IT systems. They have a lot of opportunities to just do things built in and scalable the right way for the future. So they're in a good spot too. So
yeah. So I just want to make one comment referring to the first thing you said to end this discussion. And I see here we have a number of questions that people have typed in. And that is, you were talking about the spread of biotech geographically, right?
Yeah.
That increasingly more cities and so forth, because it used to be so concentrated just up in Boston, Cambridge, or on the West Coast, so forth. And I would offer the following comment, which is it's both good and bad. The good side is that, in fact, to have a more diversity with regard to biotech research in different parts of the US and so forth is a good thing.
Yeah.
The thing to be careful about for those of you who are thinking about moving to a startup or so forth is a lot of people feel that there's a very delicate ecosystem that has to exist for there to be a very successful biotech in a particular city. And that if you're missing one element, it could be a problem. And just to overgeneralize, if you look at the centers, they tend to be places where there are research universities, where there are there's funding that's available, but also where it's an attractive environment for the biotech entrepreneurs, right? And if you're missing a number of those components, if you're missing one or two, it could be a death knell for your city, that city, to be able to really be successful. Because if you have the research, but nobody wants to live there, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to get the terrific research scientists to come join. So anyway, with that, now we have all these great questions. So why don't we start? And I guess, Lisa, you can see some of the questions here. So I guess one question is from Mille A. Medicine comes from biotechnologies would be more expensive than the ones that come from synthetic technologies or not? That's a question mark. And also, are these medicines safer than those that are from the synthetic technologies? So it's is it synthetic versus, I guess, non-synthetic, really the question. Is there a safety difference, and is there a cost difference? So I guess they're thinking about things that are made out of non-synthetic methods, or I guess natural ingredients, or Chinese medicines, all these kinds of things that are based on synthetic production of drugs.
So that is an interesting question that I technically don't know the answer to. There is, in clinical trials, when people when the companies design their programs, and this is another sticking point for the smaller biopharma, that you're only making enough batches, enough compound to be tested in clinical trial. You're not going in wholesale manufacturing. So I'm not sure, I really don't know about the synthetic difference, but clinical trials are clinical trials. They're going to cost the same no matter what. It's based on design. It's not based on the actual, it's the manufacturing of the compound, and that part, like I said, I don't know. But getting the right amount of drug out to the patient is important, and they don't want to spend a lot of money on something that might not be approved. So I don't know what the impact of the synthetic medicines are. And I don't necessarily think that they would be less costly, however, in the actual trial phase. Maybe after scale up, maybe, I'm not sure.
Yeah, my sense is that it's synthetic versus non-synthetic by itself doesn't determine whether something's safer or more expensive or less expensive. It's very situation specific. But right. I can comment on one challenge that those people who are trying to use natural ingredients, right, or derivatives are having, and that's generically true, and by the way, if you look at the history, actually, the drug industry goes back thousands of years. I mean, Chinese medicine, they may not have known exactly what the mechanism of action was, but they said, well, it seems to reduce swelling 90% of the time, and so we'll keep using it, and it didn't kill the patient, right? But the big problem is this, which is that they're all facing, and that is to the extent that it's an extracted natural ingredient, how do you make sure that that it's consistent, right? Because if when they came out with paclitaxel for cancer. Well, if you took it from yew trees, then the question is, how do you make sure that each batch is the same? And so that's a special challenge for the natural ingredients. Where synthetic, if you make a synthetic and you make a certain way, they're all going to come out the same way, or they should, right? So
that's a really good point, because if you look at the cannabis side, that's a huge area of development right now with cannabis, but the FDA doesn't want to get involved with exactly your point, Peter. They don't want to have to verify that each plant is of the same quality. That's a whole different area. That's why CBD, the synthetic compound, from cannabis, has been approved in a drug last year, Epidiolex. But because you're right, if it's a natural, how do you quantify the grade, the quality of that? And that's what FDA is about, regulatory is about. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you one kind of personal story, which is I took Kyrix public many years ago, and they made paclitaxel from yew trees from a certain place in Nepal, and they swore that because they only got it from certain yew trees in Nepal that all the trees were the same. It was an interesting argument, right?
That is. I guess if you can quantify it to a degree, then you can, with the science around it, then you can.
Now there is this question. I'm not sure I totally understand it. It says, okay, are these medicines produced in the U.S. only? Right? Question mark. And do we mention about the side effects from these medicines? I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but maybe Lisa, you do.
Well, medicines are, produced everywhere. In fact, in China, one of their major, from what I understand, they are very much wanting to produce through approved GMP facilities from the FDA. They want the world to know that they're at the global level of acceptance, or the highest level of acceptance with FDA, where they are produced. So they work very closely to get their actual manufacturing production. I'm not sure if that's what that question is. Drugs are manufactured everywhere.
Actually, a lot are manufactured in Asia, for example.
Right. And but to get them through FDA and to get them into the prescription chain, they have to be, inspected and improved. Those facilities have to be inspected and improved. So
now there's a question here, and it's an interesting question, and it's really a definitional one. And the question is, I'm going to read it. What are the different definitions of biotech? How do you define it? It seems like you're defining it by company size, et cetera. When you say biotech, are you referring to a startup or a virtual pharma company, or by the true definition of biotech, which is the nature of the technology being employed to develop the new patient medicines? For example, all large and medium pharma have biotech R&D programs based on large molecules and other routes that use biotechnology. So good question. So it's a definitional one, okay?
It is. So that is a question that we struggle with ourselves at Pharmaceutical Executive, our editors. Traditionally, we weren't always looking at this area because we didn't need to. But now that we have, you are right. Biotech is more of a term that all encompasses. So I tend to use it interchangeably between biopharma, small biopharma. So because biotech, they are not just producing medicines. Biotechnology can be used in,
making ethanol or cosmetics or it's actually a method it's a research and method, basically. It's a development method, right?
Right. And we just started calling it biotech, and then we switched to biopharma, because that, to the audience member's point, is the mechanism of large molecules. So that's where the distinction is. But it's kind of one of those things, saying Q-tip and cotton swab, although that's not a one-to-one definition, but I kind of do use it interchangeably. But your audience member's correct. They are different. And
in fact, to be clear, biotechnology is practiced both in small companies and large pharma companies. So it's a method of discovering drugs. and other things. So you're absolutely correct that we should not we should not define a biotechnology company as a small independent company, because the reality is you have more, just as much, if not more, biotechnology being practiced in the big pharma. So we, correctly, we should have been a little more precise to say that actually a lot of these issues affect people, whether they're at large pharma or independent biotech companies. But some of the comments we made were not really so much biotechnology questions. It's more, small companies versus the big companies. So we should probably have been a little more precise about that.
And the large companies, the big pharma, they all have a presence in Cambridge. There's they all have an innovation center or somewhere where they want to be immersed in that setting. So number one, to help with the development on their own, and also so they're not missing anything. They want to be with those scientists and having those discussions. So, and you're right, Peter, it is a size thing. The small, these companies are agile. They really need to make decisions on the fly, and they do. So.
Yeah, and a much bigger question really is, if biotechnology methods are being practiced both at the big pharma and by the independent companies, et cetera, and the specialty pharma companies, is there any reason, or is it just happenstance, that the productivity at the independent biotech companies has been unusually high the last 5-10 years? Or is it just happenstance, right? Is there something about organizationally about a smaller company versus a large company that causes people using exactly the same type of science, right, to be more productive or not? And you have people on both sides of that argument, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, you can't necessarily say that it's an individual, because the executives and these people go back and forth from smaller companies to larger companies every day. That's it's much more fluid than it used to be. So it's not, when we interview executives and we ask them on either side, you have to, the ones that come from large pharma to a smaller company say, you got to know that you're going to be doing a lot of the stuff yourself. You don't have a whole staff, so that's something you have to get used to. That's a cultural thing, but it's also a resource. So, and then in the smaller companies, they're just like, whoa, when they go to a big company, that's a whole different world.
Yeah.
But they do make those transitions very seamless.
The last question, and we'll end with this question, is a question about relying on overseas production and so forth, and really the question of, since so many drugs and drug ingredients come from outside the U.S., to what extent does the U.S. or the big pharma companies that have things made outside ingredients, to what extent is there control over the quality of what's being produced and then sent over here, and around that issue?
There have been a couple cases of drugs produced overseas that were not of the quality, and they did come into our supply chain here, very small amounts. So it's regulated. That's all I can say. There are very specific routes that drugs go from one place to another. And there are people that specialize in this clinic. It's not just clinical supply. The drug supply chain is highly regulated, and there are only certain ports where drugs can go through. So it's very highly controlled. I think if it weren't, we would see a lot more problems if it wasn't successful. So I'm not sure if, so they are right. It does need to be controlled tightly. And right now, I think the government is considering allowing more drugs to come in from Canada. But again, it's going to go through a very rigorous process.
Well, it was a very good question, because actually the various parties who manage the control inspection process, it's complicated. certainly the US FDA does, in fact, technically have a responsibility of trying to inspect overseas plants, et cetera. For example, in China and India, where they've had the most quality issues with regard to
Correct.
APIs, et cetera,
Yeah.
local authorities have sometimes fallen down on the job. In fact, the head of the Chinese FDA had a big scandal and actually was executed because of
Yes.
impurities that were not found and regulated by the Chinese FDA. So I guess that sent a big message. So it's really a bunch of things, and I think it is a challenge because your problem is it's a lot easier for the US FDA to inspect US manufacturing facilities than facilities in India and China or other places. And they're trying to make sure, I mean, the good news is, in spite of how difficult it is, Lisa, you're right, which is the number of incidences of contaminated or whatever hasn't been that high, but it's a challenge, right? It's a big challenge for everyone involved.
It is a challenge, and if people want to factor that challenge in with the overall cost of drugs, you can say our quality is right there, and quality is a goal, and it is managed in this country very well. And
Yeah.
and Peter, you're right about there have been many instances in China, and that's why the companies that want to be accepted, the Chinese companies that want to be accepted and recognized for the science that they have, are very focused on this manufacturing aspect because they don't want to be lumped in with those bad actors.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and on that note, first of all, Lisa, I really want to thank you very much for this very thoughtful discussion and a fairly balanced discussion about both the good things and the negatives associated with biotechnology industry. And I also want to thank those of you who've been listening in. We've had a very nice group of people who've been watching and some very good questions. I want to thank you for participating. I've enjoyed this dialogue with you, Lisa.
Yeah, I have too. Thank you so much, Peter. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you, audience.
You to enjoy the 2 salaries you get for being I hope you're spending it wisely, so forth.
I'm investing in biotechs. No, I'm only kidding.
Exactly. But for those of you, we just say that I hope you appreciated this, and we may look into posting and recording this, but we'll discuss that with Lisa. But also I want to remind you, September 24th, we will have one on rare earths, which are very important both for life sciences and the electronics industry. So please tune into that if you're interested. So thank you all, and thank you, Lisa, for the pleasure of this interview. And I want to thank everyone in the audience.